Can we take it from the top, Jim? When did your antennae first start twitching?
So I have colleagues who are much smarter than me who were doing freedom of information requests last year on this peculiarity that Greensill, the company, had 10 meetings with senior Treasury officials at the start of last year when the pandemic erupted. And 10 meetings is obviously completely out of whack with the one or two meetings that other companies and other organisations were getting. But those FOIs were knocked back repeatedly for many, many months. And then finally I got a rock-solid tip in March, which enabled us to eventually write the story, front-page story, that David Cameron had lobbied senior figures in the Treasury and Number 10 to try to facilitate improvements to various debt schemes to the benefit of his billionaire paymaster, Lex Greensill.
Gosh. This is a question that I will ask you on the provision that you promise not to laugh at me.
Sure.
Thank you. How do you gauge the scale of a story like this when you're working on it? I mean, you have been in the game for a long time. You've seen stories come and go. This one has gathered pace, hasn't it, since March the 19th when you published your first report. I suppose what I'm asking you is, did you realise from...
Yeah, James. So I'm going to be honest with you. This was all down to my brilliant colleagues. So in particular Rob Smith, in particular Cynthia O'Murchie. Rob Smith has been looking at the weird connections between Greensill and Liberty with other colleagues for literally over 18 months. So when I was first told, someone sent me a message 6 weeks ago referring to Lex, and I nearly replied saying, who the hell is Lex?
Of
and
course.
I thought, that's not very professional. I'm going to quickly Google and get up to speed with it. So I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of some brilliant reporting by colleagues.
Okay.
And then when I realised, when you realise that the former Prime Minister used his personal connections to lobby senior ministers to basically for financial gain, I realised that this was going to be a very big story. But the fascinating thing about this is that although the David Cameron lobbying is a big story in and of itself, I think when people get their heads around what's been happening at Greensill and how it has financed the expansion of Liberty Steel and various other companies owned by Sanjeev Gupta, who's this massive tycoon, when they get their head around how there are massive questions about this that the German investigators are looking at, BaFin, sort of financial crime unit, is looking at Greensill Bank in Germany. There are, the British government has basically said that they won't bail out Liberty because they don't trust Gupta not to disappear with the 170 million quid he's asking for. I think the story is going to move on to the fact, not just Cameron, but these slightly unsavoury people he was representing.
And Cameron could probably claim disassociation there, couldn't he?
I wouldn't be surprised if he never fully got his head around
what he was doing.
What Richard Fuller has used parliamentary privilege in the House of Commons to basically compare to a Ponzi scheme. I think, being fair to Dave, he may not have necessarily understood the full nature of this company, which my colleagues have recently reported. Some invoices have come to light claiming to be, Liberty had claimed that these companies had done business with them. These companies, at least 6 of them, have said they hadn't done business with Liberty. So I've been very careful about the language I choose.
I notice you are, and I've read the articles you refer to. And
I would suggest people Google them, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that particular angle is frankly astonishing. I don't know why we think that something huge must be immune from the kind of issues that you're very diplomatically describing, but that perhaps is part of David Cameron's problem, is that the size of the rewards on the table were so enormous that he didn't look the other way, but he certainly didn't look hard enough in the right direction. And speaking of the rewards, that was a particularly mealy-mouthed bit of his statement, wasn't it? He denied that the shares he'd been offered were worth anything like the amount speculated in the press, but notable entirely by its absence was an admission of how much they were worth.
Yeah, I thought it was hilarious. So we first reported 5 or 6 weeks ago that he'd been promised 1% of the company, like 1% would have been worth something like $70 million if the company had floated at the $7 billion that people were talking about. A few weeks later, the Times said that Cameron had boasted to friends that his share options would be worth about $60 million. Yeah. There have been other permutations in a similar kind of zone. I mean, this statement that he put out the other night, there were various parts of it which did stick in the craw. There was the bit about how his trip to the Saudi desert, hanging out with MBS for 3 days with Lex Greensill on some camping trip. And he said, I raised human rights issues with MBS. Who's the guy that ordered the killing and dismemberment of a prominent Saudi dissident journalist. That isn't very believable. This thing where he says, all these reports about the potential riches I would have made are wrong, but he won't say what the actual figure is. Until he says what the actual figure is, I'm inclined to disbelieve his claims. I mean, there are other parts of his statement where I have slightly more sympathy.
Go on.
I have no problem with former politicians, former prime ministers making money in the private sector. I have no problem with him charging £100,000 to make a speech. I personally wouldn't pay for that. You probably wouldn't either. But, that's fine. But the thing that will anger many people is this idea of using personal connections in politics to make a quick buck in the way that, other struggling companies in March and April last year did not get anything like as much access, and he did.
And that is, going to be a source of great anger and upset for people who feel their livelihoods have been, in a sense, sacrificed on the altar of some of Rishi Sunak's policies. But and I don't know if you're comfortable being tempted into sort of speculation that this doesn't necessarily touch Boris Johnson, does it, Jim?
No, I think Boris Johnson was broadly unaware of it. I mean, there was a special advisor, Sheridan Westlake, who was approached in number 10, and then I think he handed it back over to the Treasury. It's not clear that Boris Johnson necessarily knew about this at all. And clearly the two went to Eton in different years. They're kind of political rivals. They're kind of political frenemies. Like, they'll occasionally go for a meal together, but they are not pals. And I think what's very interesting is that what we have seen over the last couple of years is we've seen the Boris Johnson administration just create this political ground zero where everyone forgets, or a lot of voters forget, that this party's been in power for 11 years. And Boris Johnson acts as if he's come out of nowhere with this whole new rhetoric, and it's fascinating. He's totally disowned the Cameron era, and it's worked very well for him politically, because when he says we're going to restore life to these left behind northern towns, the answer isn't, people aren't saying, well, hang on, you've had over a decade to do this, you guys. People are listening to it, and they kind of like the positivity.
Yes, I touched on that with Theo Usherwood, our own political editor, just a moment ago. Aside then from the Liberty Steel story, what do you expect to happen next? I know you're on your holidays at the moment, so what is going to be at the top of your to-do list when you get back to the office? Well,
I have plenty of leads which I need to look at, and I've got a few Freedom of Information requests, some of which are due quite soon because I put them in 20 working days ago. I think the question, I suppose, is where is this inquiry that Boris Johnson launched yesterday going to go? And on the face of it, it's just an inquiry into supply chain finance in the government, which makes it sound as if the heavy emphasis is going to be why was Lex Greensill given this unpaid advisory role in 2011 from which he tried to flog his,
and that, of course,
his ideas.
That, of course, sits alongside the claim from David Cameron that he hardly knew him during that period. So he's walking around with business cards, a touch of the Adam Werrities, but while simultaneously Cameron is claiming that he'd hardly ever heard of this person who's describing himself as a special advisor.
I mean, it would be pretty easy to disprove that if David Cameron was lying, and I think there probably is some truth in Cameron's suggestion that he wasn't the instigator of putting Greensill into Whitehall. If you look at it, Jeremy Hayward, who was head of the civil service at the time, was really good mates with Lex Greensill, worked with him at Morgan Stanley. He was the one, if you look at the emails that the Sunday Times brilliantly got hold of the other day, it's obviously coming from Jeremy Hayward, that whole push. I think it's hard to know whether Hayward was sort of taken in by what he thought was the brilliance of the supply chain finance. But the question people have asked is obviously, if you just want suppliers to get paid faster, why didn't the government just pay them faster? But anyway, let's see what happens there. I think if the inquiry focuses